Welcome to the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations Interviews podcast, a series of brief conversations with leading China experts on key issues in the Sino-American relationship. For more interviews, videos, and links to events, visit us at www.ncuscr.org.
Welcome to our speakers and viewers. My name is Margot Landman. I am Deputy Vice President for Programs at the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. When we began thinking some time ago about a program on the U.S. troop withdrawal from Afghanistan and its implications for Sino-U.S. relations, we had no idea of the state of crisis we would find ourselves in today. Fortunately, we have with us now three experts who will help us to understand the current situation and what may happen down the line. Our experts include Nifa Yao, joining us from Bishkek, and Derek Grossman in Los Angeles. Moderating will be Daniel Markey, Senior Research Professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS. His latest book, published last year, is entitled China's Western Horizon, Beijing and the New Geopolitics of Eurasia. Very apropos. I will turn the floor over to Dan, who will introduce the speakers and begin with some context to set the stage for the rest of the discussion. Dan, it's all yours.
Great, thank you, Margot. It's a real pleasure to be able to moderate this conversation today for the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. What I want to do is briefly introduce our two speakers. Their full bios should be available on the website. First of all, we have Derek Grossman. He's a senior defense analyst at RAND. He served for over a decade in the intelligence community, including at the Defense Intelligence Agency. He's an adjunct professor at the University of Southern California, and his work appears regularly in The Diplomat as well as in other major publications. And we also have Nifa Yao, who is a researcher at the OSCE Academy in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. She's a fellow at the Eurasia program of the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia as well. And her writings on China's relations in its Western neighborhood have been featured in a wide range of international publications and news outlets. She's originally from Hong Kong, and she has been based in Bishkek since 2018. So welcome to both of you. To kick things off, I'd like to just try to set the scene. Obviously, developments in Afghanistan are moving very quickly. We've seen really shocking developments on the ground, at least from a Washington perspective, over the past few weeks, culminating, of course, in the Taliban sweeping into Kabul this past weekend, unopposed at that point by government forces. The Afghan government effectively collapsed. President Ashraf Ghani fled and has since reemerged in the UAE. Now, U.S. policy has shifted pretty rapidly to focus almost now entirely on humanitarian evacuations, beginning with U.S. personnel and other international officials, and now increasingly focusing on Afghans who have worked closely with international partners over the past 2 decades. For their part, the Taliban appear to be consolidating their control over the country, or at least trying to. They have put down some recent protests out in the countryside and in some of the cities, and have announced an amnesty for former government officials, as well as their own plans for forming a new government, a government that will be based, they say, on Sharia law and definitely not on democracy. But the situation remains fluid. It's not clear how the Taliban will actually govern at home or what sorts of relationships they're going to have with the rest of the world. And that's mainly what we want to talk about today. We have a particular focus on how a post-America Afghanistan is likely to relate to China, to understand better the view from Beijing, and to understand better how the already difficult US-China relationship is likely to be affected by developments in Afghanistan. So let me kick things off with first a question to you, Derek. We all know and have heard for a very long time about China's principle of non-interference in the politics of other states. But in recent years, Beijing has really seemed to play games with both the Afghan government and the Taliban, as well as other segments of Afghan society. And so for you, I'd like to, maybe you can play around with this and try to figure out or interpret what Beijing has done, what it's actually trying to accomplish inside of Afghanistan, whether it's remained true to this claim of non-interference, and whether, if you push a little bit further, whether it can, if it has been non-interfering so far, can it afford to stick with that moving forward?
Yeah, thanks, Daniel, and thanks to everybody for hosting this event. So, yeah, I would say that you're right. You're absolutely right that China's official policy is one of non-interference, but it's highly debatable whether they have been non-interfering in Afghanistan over the last few years. I mean, of course, we saw last month on July 28th, the Taliban leadership were invited to China for high-level discussions. And, you know, it's not the first time that happened. In 2019, the Taliban also visited China. You know, unofficially, there have been contacts dating back many, many years. So China's really sort of been preparing for this exact moment, if it ever came to pass. And of course it did. And so now China, I think, feels it's still pretty nervous about Taliban leadership. They can't exactly trust the Taliban. Will the Taliban do what it says in terms of making sure Afghanistan does not become a future hotbed of terrorism that could affect external states, including China? Even though the Taliban's saying all the right things right now in their first ever press conference a couple of days ago, for example. You know, so they can't exactly trust them, but they also have gotten to know them over the last few years. And they have Pakistan, their ironclad brother, born of, you know, decades of partnership through all types of different situations. And so I think they're going to rely a lot on Pakistan to better understand the Taliban and to try to trust them. The big question right now is, will China officially recognize the Taliban? And I think it's just a matter of time. I'm not going to put a time date on it, you know, but I think it's probably weeks, maybe perhaps months, but it's certainly not years, because China wants to ensure that its counterterrorism objectives are being met. And it also wants to access Afghanistan at some point in the future to extract natural resources. And to do that, you really have to recognize the Taliban at some point in time. But
Great. Yeah, you touched on a lot of different things, and I want to be able to circle back a bit in our conversation to a few of them. But let me just push you just briefly on this. You know, it's one thing to have conversations with the Taliban. It's another to be interfering, so to speak, in the politics of Afghanistan. So regardless of where China draws the line, how do you interpret what they are doing and what they are likely to do? Talks, fine. Pushing them, cajoling them, incentivizing them, even bribing or paying them off. How far do you think China will go to push its interests in this way in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Chinese could easily turn that around and say, well, the U.S. meets with opposition leaders all the time, and so meetings, by their very definition, do not meet the threshold of interfering. But you know, you're right. I mean, have they been supporting Taliban leaders behind the scenes monetarily with arms, et cetera? And I think a lot of that is not known publicly. And if we were to discover later on that, in fact, yeah, they have been supporting the Taliban quite a bit, then, you know, that would be, I think, a clearer violation of their non-interference policy. But let's be honest, though, the non-interference policy is on paper. It doesn't really matter in practice. China uses non-interference as a way to kind of differentiate itself from the US and from other countries it believes in the West that are interfering in mostly authoritarian nations worldwide. And so it's trying to strike a contrast there, but in practice, it's doing much of the same things that we would do.
Good, thanks. Yeah, Neva, I want to bring you in now and get you to speak a little bit about a recent conversation that got a lot of attention between Foreign Minister Wang Yi and Secretary of State Blinken when they talked about Afghanistan earlier this week. And my read of at least the Chinese reporting here is that it was clear that Wang Yi took it as an opportunity to criticize US policy, certainly in Afghanistan, but also, as is commonly done, to criticize the United States for efforts to, quote, contain and suppress China. So it might not have been the easiest conversation. But at the same time, they talked about ways that the United States and China might be able to at least coordinate, if not cooperate, on a variety of interests in Afghanistan. So I wonder, what you make of the phone call, but also what you make of the potential for that kind of cooperation.
The tone of criticizing the US is a very commonplace that now we see with whichever diplomat that is giving out a speech around the world. So this is no exception. But regarding Afghanistan, at this moment, the United States and China have one shared position. And that is that both countries want Taliban to establish an inclusive government, including the former Afghan government, and also Taliban assurance that they will not harbor other international terrorist groups. And Wang Yi was very clear about having more dialogue and actually work with the US on this to prevent a new civil war and also humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. But on the other hand, the options for China to actually stay engaged and work with the Afghanistan situation do not necessarily align with the US options. China will most likely work within the mechanisms of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to cushion the effects on the region and in Xinjiang on issues relating to radicalization of Islam, such as foreign fighter recruitment and weapons trafficking. Next month, we are expecting a formal signature at the SCO Head of State Summit in Dushanbe, Tajikistan, where Iran is going to sign on as an official member of the SCO. This now is going to allow for an all-round encirclement to contain the most immediate effects resulting from the international terrorist groups in Afghanistan. But in the case of SCO, the US actually has one option to use institutions such as the OSCE to work with the SCO. In fact, actually since 2016, there has been a closer relationship between SCO and OSCE in Central Asia, where SCO officials have been sitting at OSCE conferences and workshops, learning how the OSCE deals with terrorism and radical Islam issues. While being a majority European organization, the US is a member of the OSCE and should empower and expand the work.
Interesting. So you touched upon some of the mechanisms by which the United States and China might at least indirectly coordinate on counterterrorism inside of Afghanistan. But one of the points that Wang Yi also made was a point of criticism about the United States for changing its stance on ETIM in Afghanistan. And that raises the question about whether the United States and China, even when they say the word terrorism, whether they mean the same thing. I'd be curious Neva, what you make of that on that point.
China right now has enough capacity to keep out the East Turkestan movement away from Xinjiang, for sure. China's main concern, given the current situation, is about the revival of the East Turkestan activities in this neighborhood, which China has spent the past 20 years through the SCO to actually get rid of these activities. So if Afghanistan becomes an even more attractive hub for international terrorist groups, these activities, including those of the East Turkestans, will overspill to Central Asia. China at the SCO will step up efforts to keep out these effects. And this is an area that the US can come in and share experience, insights, and jointly combat these activities of those international terrorist groups in Afghanistan. Even if the US does not reinstate the ban on East Turkestan, China will still need the experiences and the capacity from US to support the expected increase of radicalization in Central Asia. This cooperation will be valuable to US to maintain presence in this region and continue to work with allies in Central Asia, such as Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan.
Interesting. So you've made the point, you would say that ETIM is a serious threat, or at least perceived that way by China, and that maybe cooperation or learning from the United States could be helpful there. Derek, let me toss this back to you. I mean, do you see ETIM as a real or potential real threat to China? Is Beijing correct to fear that a Taliban-led Afghanistan will be a major security threat to China, or is this overblown? And to what extent, coming back to the cooperation with the United States, to what extent do our differences over Xinjiang and the broader issues of Uyghurs and separatism in China, how do those differences play out in terms of our views on Afghanistan?
Yeah, so I mean, whether ETIM actually exists or not, I think is a point of huge controversy between the U.S. and China. Right out, you got to look at the history here. Right after 9/11, as kind of an olive branch to Beijing, Washington put ETIM on the State Department's terrorism list in 2002. But the Trump administration last year took ETIM off, stating that, you know, there was no real evidence that the group even existed anymore. So, but Beijing at least thinks it does exist. And so that is, you know, I think fueling a lot of their concerns about what just took place in Afghanistan and how the Taliban may support ETIM going forward. One of the things I saw recently, and I thought this was pretty interesting, is the last, at least public report that the Chinese have produced on Taliban support to ETIM was in 2002, and it cited that there were at least 400 attacks or attempted attacks that were supported by the Taliban, in which the ETIM was supported by the Taliban to conduct attacks in Xinjiang province. So, I mean, the concern I think is real in that sense, but you know, we can still debate about how potent this group is or whether it actually exists from like a, you know, a Western definitional point about terrorist organizations. But then on your other point about Xinjiang, so I think, you know, it's interesting, US-China relations obviously have really deteriorated in the last few years, but one area in which there was always hope for cooperation was on Afghanistan, because when you think about it, the US and China both want, in broad brushstrokes, stability, right? But when you kind of peel away that onion just a little bit, you find out that the whole situation falls apart, because for China, stability means Taliban or anybody, frankly, who can maintain control of the country. Human rights be damned, okay? And treatment of their own people be damned. The US wants stability, but doesn't want to see the Taliban, you know, take advantage of the Afghan people. And so I think that that's going to be a real kind of dividing line that's going to crop up very, very soon. And it's going to be yet another area of US-China irritation, unfortunately.
Great point. Neva, shifting gears a little bit, I know a lot of your work is focused on the Belt and Road, China's Belt and Road Initiative, and the broader questions of economic development in the region. And I guess the question that's on a lot of people's minds is, how does this rapid deterioration of the situation in Afghanistan affect China's view of the potential for Belt and Road, and how China may go about pursuing this initiative in the nearby neighborhood, the Western neighborhood, in light of these developments. And, you know, Derek earlier mentioned Pakistan, and I think this is a critically important piece of it, because there had been some conversations about, say, extending the China-Pakistan economic corridor into Afghanistan. Is all that off the table now? What do you think Beijing will make of this going forward?
The first time that the topic of including Afghanistan into the Belt and Road Initiative was around 2016. I think if we end up with a solid Taliban victory, China will not hesitate to recognize Taliban's legitimate political leadership and to go in with a post-war reconstruction. China needs to create an economic leverage to secure an effective communication with Taliban. And Taliban can also use this channel of Chinese financial support to maintain its rule in areas where the Taliban leadership does not have a full grip on. So specifically about the relation with Pakistan, and specifically about, you know, the China-Pakistan economic corridor and the Belt and Road Initiative, well, both of these things are all about connectivity. And yes, with a solid Taliban victory, it is very likely to start seeing Chinese companies building roads and connecting more parts of Afghanistan, but this is only a start. Navigating the local dynamics will be very difficult for Chinese companies who want to start working on more expensive projects in the mining and oil and gas sector. Some areas of Afghanistan will get more money than others, and this is going to view a very different local conflict dynamic that China is definitely not prepared for. Both Pakistan and India welcome connectivity projects with Central Asia via Afghanistan. This has been in the talks for years. So if we have a more stable and predictable environment in the region, this is definitely good for not just China, but also good for US's policy in the region for a long time, which is having a north-south connectivity between these two regions. But the problem is for China working with Pakistan is actually centralized more at the highest level of the government. And it has been stripping away the decision-making power of provincial level governments granted by the local political structure, as well as alienating many local communities on the ground. So this is a dynamic between China and Pakistan right now. And with the Pakistan situation, it's going to make China's ties with Pakistani government even closer. So all of this talk about Chinese investments, of course, is expected, but not expected, in the next few months, is in the medium term after we see a more stable situation in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. Derek, just picking up on something, Neva, one piece of what Neva was just talking about, and you had mentioned before this issue of diplomatic recognition by China of Afghanistan, of the circumstances in Afghanistan. And you opened by speaking a bit about this. I just wonder, given what Neva was just talking about the economic potential there, in what ways is the diplomatic recognition issue materially important going forward? It's important for China and Afghanistan in economic terms. In what other terms, and how might it play into the China-US relationship as well?
Yeah, well, so before the Taliban took power on August 15th, they had made a series of statements through their spokesman. One of them was that the Taliban would not interfere in China. I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially it was that the Taliban would not seek to interfere in the internal affairs of China. And that was music to the leadership's ears in Beijing, right? I mean, and that's code for we're not going to mess with Xinjiang. Another statement that the Taliban made in the run-up to them seizing power again was on Chinese investment in infrastructure development programs in Afghanistan. The Taliban said that they are welcomed to help in post-war reconstruction. And so if you're China, you have to think, if we delay on recognizing the Taliban, if we wait months and others jump in, if Pakistan, Iran, maybe Russia, right? What is that going to look like for us? Is the Taliban going to kind of start to reverse those moments of goodwill that it showed before the takeover? And we don't want to get left out of that. So I think it's an important thing that they got to be thinking about right now in Beijing.
That's great. Let me now, we've got only a little bit of time left, but I want to talk about the US-China bilateral relationship. And one of the points that's come up a number of times, at least in the media, is a desire on the part of certain Chinese officials, it seems, to draw connections between what the United States has done in Afghanistan and what the United States might or might not do in Taiwan. And this is a pretty sensitive issue, but I wonder, Derek, let's start with you. How should Taiwan view US security guarantees in the light of an apparent lack of commitment to a different ally and a very different part of the world in Afghanistan? Are these things connected, or should we see them as very separate issues?
Yeah, I know there's been a lot of discussion about this, unfortunately. And, I think they're apples and oranges, frankly. We were in Afghanistan for 20 years trying to build up their security forces to withstand, the Taliban, right? And we decided that we had enough. If China, God forbid, were ever to try to invade Taiwan or anything short, take military action short of that against Taiwan, Taiwan needs to know that the United States is going to intervene and assist it in repelling those attacks. That is dramatically a different scenario than what we saw in Afghanistan. And I don't think that I think there's very little reason for Taiwan to question our commitments to the island. There's a lot of other points I could raise, but I'll leave it there because I know we're short on time.
No, that's great. Let me begin to wrap up. Neva, you're in a different part of the world. Sitting in Bishkek, you've got a different perspective, and one of the things that I imagine is more on your mind, in addition to how Central Asian states are seeing things in Afghanistan, would be how Russia is seeing things, and how this unraveling in Afghanistan plays into the Russia-China relationship. Do you think they're on the same page? In Afghanistan, Russia and China. Do you think that this will play to further advance what seems to be a remarkable alignment that persists between them, or do you think this will be an irritant, like some other issues in the region, actually push China in different directions from Russia?
When it comes to Afghanistan right now, Russia and China are definitely on the same page. Particularly, I expect that through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, China and Russia will definitely work together to provide more security capacity to the countries bordering Afghanistan, because both China and Russia do not want to see Central Asia become radicalized. Millions of people from Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan work in Russia as low-skilled workers, and Russia depends on these populations for its economy, but they also at the same time bring a high risk of terrorism when the region becomes more radicalized. And China as well believes that a radicalized Central Asia will bring their ideologies to Xinjiang with human mobility through businesses and family links. So both Russia and China wants to maintain its position in Central Asia as the security provided in order to cushion these effects. And we can expect many more initiatives within the SCO, especially in the coming month with the summit.
That's great. So continuing with this question of potential alignments and wrapping up, I guess, Derek, let me turn it back to you. If China and the United States can see through to find pieces of cooperative ventures in Afghanistan, particularly on countering terrorism, as we've talked about a bit so far, is that likely to make much of a difference to their ability to cooperate in other venues? You mentioned how the broader bilateral has really deteriorated over the years. Is Afghanistan still an opportunity for finding some positive out of this and potentially working to find avenues of cooperation, say on climate change or elsewhere? Is there anything positive here in terms of the U.S.-China relationship?
Yeah, that's a good question, a tough one to answer. My view is that China actually now has the inside track on Afghanistan and therefore has the leverage because they have Pakistan. Pakistan has developed a relationship over decades with the new rulers of Afghanistan, the Taliban, right? And so what are we really going to offer China in Afghanistan? That's what I'm trying to figure out, on your question. The Chinese would love to, do something for us in exchange for something really big, concessions on Taiwan or something like South China Sea, something like that. But we're, at least under the Biden administration, we're not going down that path. We're looking at climate change and non-proliferation and things like that. And so, I don't really see much leverage anymore, unfortunately. I hate to be cynical about it, but that's the truth.
So the United States doesn't have much leverage to entice the Chinese to cooperate in this area. But Neva, you've suggested that there's at least some degree of overlapping concern with respect to terrorism. So I guess maybe I'll frame it a different way. Even if the United States has relatively less to offer, you've suggested China could learn some lessons from at least technical lessons, U.S. tactical efforts against terrorist organizations. Do you see the potential that might bleed over, in a sense, in a positive way, into other aspects of U.S.-China relations, or is this just a very Afghanistan-specific area of cooperation that probably isn't going to redound to the benefit of the broader bilateral relationship?
This is definitely a very Afghanistan-specific situation because right now, China and US are on the same page in the sense that they have the same interests regarding these terrorist groups that are radical Islamic groups that see US as the enemy, but at the same time, this is not, China's a friend in either, because China also do not want to see more Islamic radical groups, particularly in Central Asia and also in other parts of the world, in the Eurasia continent. So whereas the climate change issue for China, like many other things, like the non-intervention, policy, the efforts that China say they will commit to is just letters on a piece of paper. When we look at what actually China is doing domestically regarding climate change, we see that nothing is really happening. It's all just promises and no commitments. And this is, China put their economy first, and they will not commit to any policies that reverse the economic stability of China. So when it comes to climate change, this is not an area that China and US will actually find common ground, but Afghanistan can be, because the US and China right now do have a common interest.
So not a lot of potential linkage there. I guess, again, because you're sitting in Central Asia, I'd be curious to follow up on what China has done very specifically on the ground in the neighborhood in a security sense. A number of reports over the years in terms of Chinese activities in Tajikistan and trying to stem the flow of people and fighters, even just ideas, propaganda, and so on into China. Do you perceive that more of that is likely now? What do you make of China's willingness to take an active or more active security role on Afghanistan's border?
So we have to keep in mind that, what China is worried about is not that Taliban or terrorist groups getting into China, but what China cares about the most is that Central Asia becomes more radicalized. So in this sense, China's prime strategy right now is making sure that there is border security in Central Asia, amongst the different Central Asian countries, and also between the borders of Central Asia and China. So in the past 5 years, we've seen an annually military exercises and border exercises that go to these borders and inspect. And also China is undergoing a 3D mapping actually of the border between China and Central Asia. And this is going to have satellites that monitor the mobility in that region. So China is not so much incapable of this. And at the same time, we have to bear in mind what is China's biggest concern, and that is radicalization in Central Asia. So one of the very interesting things that China has done in the past couple of years is that since 2015, China has implemented many policies and initiatives within the SCO, specifically on cybersecurity. And this is not about hacking into websites, hacking into government infrastructure, but this is about how international terrorist groups are using the internet to recruit fighters to go to Afghanistan or go to Syria, or they are using internet to promote ideology of radicalization and support different international terrorist groups. So China has been hosting a cybersecurity exercise every 2 years since 2015 in Xiamen under the structure of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And this has massively increased the capacity of Central Asian forces in dealing with these websites and effectively shutting them down. And it is an area that will definitely increase now.
Great. Well, it looks like we're running out of time, or we've run out of time, but I do want to thank both of you, not only for your insights, but for insights that in some ways contrast with some of the public reporting that has focused so extensively on things, whether it's the connection with Taiwan, or the ways in which China might become more immediately involved in Afghanistan that seem, at least according to our conversation, a little less likely. So I think in a quick amount of time, we've gotten past the headlines into the depth, and I really appreciate both of you for doing that. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. I want to reiterate what Dan just said. I think events have happened so incredibly quickly that a lot of the reporting has been breathless. And all three of you have encouraged us all to take deep breaths and step back and think about what's happening in the broader context, the historical context, the geographical context. And that's an incredible service to everybody who's really concerned about an obvious flashpoint in the world. So thanks to the three of you, thanks to our audience for sticking with us, and thanks to the National Committee staff who've made today's interview possible.
For more interviews, videos, and links to events like this one, visit us at www.ncuscr.org.